This is Eitan Weinstein.
And I'm Naor Menninger, and you're listening to Two Nice Jewish Boys.
In recent years, Israel has faced a critical problem, as certain NGOs funded by foreign countries have been accused of supporting terror and advocating for the destruction of Israel. Last week, the government, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, introduced legislation aimed at preventing these NGOs from receiving tax reductions. The intention behind this move was to deter foreign countries from supporting Palestinian NGOs with questionable affiliations. However, the proposed law ignited an uproar among EU states, further highlighting the complex and sensitive nature of this issue and putting the legislation on ice. Amidst the landscape, NGO Monitor has emerged as a prominent initiative shedding light on the actions and influence of international NGOs in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Founded by Professor Gerald Steinberg, a distinguished political scientist, NGO Monitor aims to provide critical analysis and distribute reports on the work of these NGOs. By doing so, they seek to promote transparency and provide necessary context in an often complex and polarizing environment. Today, we are honored to have Professor Gerald Steinberg as our guest on the show. With a background in political science and extensive experience as a consultant to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Israeli National Security Council, Professor Steinberg is a leading authority on the subject. As the founder and president of NGO Monitor, he brings a wealth of knowledge and insights into the motivations and impact of NGOs working against Israel. Join us as we delve into this important topic and gain a deeper understanding of the complexities surrounding NGOs in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Thank you, and I'm honored to be here as well.
Any remarks on the...
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments on the introduction.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for all the nice words. I am guilty of having realized that non-governmental organizations are not always non-governmental. In fact, all the ones we're talking about today are not really governmental. Sometimes they're called GONGOs, sometimes they're called FONGOs, foreign government funded. And I, as an academic, began to realize that this was a serious issue, needed to be studied, needed to be researched. In your introduction, you talked about legislation. It wasn't a government move. It was one member of the Knesset. Mm-hmm. And it was withdrawn. It was predictably withdrawn. It was not carefully thought out in the sense that the language that was used before it even got to the Ministerial Committee on Legislation, which had to approve it and decided not even raise it, the language that was in the draft that was circulated would have affected hundreds, perhaps thousands of Israeli institutions that have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all the controversial political issues. This is a much wider issue, and it also does reflect to the degree that Israel is dependent on foreign funding and very often foreign government funding, whether it's in hospitals, museums, other frameworks. And so it'll have to be the legislation, which is probably not the best way to deal with this issue. We can certainly talk about other ways of dealing with it, has been withdrawn. It will either have to be rewritten or the whole concept needs to be rethought. And I assume in the next 45 minutes that we're going to be talking about this, we'll talk about a lot of different ways to approach this and why it's so important.
So it was a bad legislation.
Well, it was also because it wasn't even something that the government considered. It was one member of the Knesset who's not a minister. He's a
Likud member.
He is a Likud member, but in many ways it was a personal initiative. I think in general, if you're going to do legislation, you got, especially if it's going to be controversial, you have to line up the different powers and assess what the odds are, who's going to be supporting you, who's going to be against you, what the issues are going to be, and then decide how to approach it strategically.
Also, because failure often can set you back. It's not costless if you don't get it past the goal
whole
line.
issue, in fact, may have been of dealing with what is really unprecedented foreign government intervention through what's often called the NGO game. In Israel, it's unprecedented. There's no other country in the world that gets subjected to the type of manipulation that goes through these political NGOs through European governments. And absolutely, you're right, that what we have now is a situation where there was an initiative, European governments pushed back, others pushed back and disappeared. And there's a cost to that.
So maybe tell us, like, give us like the background, but give it to us maybe in a story, in an example. Like, what's an European NGO that is super questionable that funds? A European government
country
that funds an NGO here in Israel that's super questionable. Can you?
I'm going to give you a story, or more than one story if you want, in a minute. A lot of stories, but I'll just say that we're talking about an industry that first of all, there's a worldwide industry that is largely not subject to checks and balances. I won't say it's unregulated. It's regulated in a very narrow sense. But unlike the marketplace, corporations, businesses where there's competition and where investments and expenditures, everything that's public has to be reported on in great detail. And if you fail, you're out of the business. None of those criteria apply to the NGO industry. It's a hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, euros around the world. And in the Israeli-Palestinian case, we're talking about at least 250 million euros, of which close to maybe 170 million is funded by European governments, to some degree, occasionally a little bit US, a little bit Canadian, a little bit Australian, but primarily European. That's a large amount of money. And there's really no oversight.
Annually.
Annually,
250
absolutely.
million and 170 million annually.
Exactly. All these are annual numbers. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It has you buy a lot of influence, you buy a lot of PR, and that's what we see in all these processes. Some stories, and you'll tell me when you want to shift from stories to more analysis, but I'll tell you my own stories first. How did I get into this business, and why has it been the main focus of my activities for 20 years? First, I should say that I have been teaching international politics in a broad sense, but mostly in the realm of nuclear strategy and arms control and things like that. It's nothing to do with NGOs. I came to Israel after I finished my doctorate at Cornell in the nuclear proliferation and related issues area. Started teaching in 1982, so I've been doing this for over 40 years. And I hadn't touched NGOs for the first almost 20 years of that time. And then I went to some meetings, some conferences in Europe around the late 1990s and around 2000. I went to one conference that really stuck out. It was on regulation of landmines. And there was a worldwide initiative, and I was asked to go as the Israeli non-governmental expert. In other words, I wasn't a member of the Israeli government. I did some consulting for the Israeli government, but I was never had any official position in the Israeli government. And I was invited because Israeli government officials tend to be very narrow in what they can talk about. If you're an academic, you can float around a bit. You can play with different ideas. This landmine convention was important because they were not just around in our area, but in all places where there have been wars over the last even 50, 60, 70 years, but particularly since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, you had areas in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, all those areas. There were mines that were exploding that had been left over from wars that had ended. And we had them, of course, in our region, and all of our borders where mines were used. In the Sinai, mines were used extensively. Golan, Israelis, Syrians, Egyptians, everybody was using mines in every other conflict. Mine issues in the wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I could go through the entire world. And that was what this convention was designed to prevent the spread of mines around the world, and also to come up with mechanisms for demining in areas that are deconflicted. And Israel was considered to be an important player. The United States, the main powers, the United States, by that time it was Russia, China, the major powers did not agree to this, did not sign on, and also a number of countries that are involved in conflicts like Israel. I get to this conference in Geneva, which is basically run by non-governmental organizations. The Landmine Convention was an initiative of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and a couple other groups. They got a Nobel Prize for it. And what do I see as I walk around the convention area, both in the UN and outside? A lot of booths handing out material. What were they handing out? Many of them were handing out flyers Some of them handed out CDs or DVDs. I don't remember what technology we had in those days, and also yearbooks. And the dominant theme was Israel is killing Palestinians because of landmines. And I realized that the main annual report of this organization, again run by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, was a posed fake photograph of what was supposed to be a Palestinian child, and it had one of those triangular or sometimes rectangular signs that you see in the Golan that says Sakana or something like Zihirut, Mokshim, exactly.
Beware of the mines.
And it was clear that this was a posed picture. It wasn't something you could. The kid was in rags.
What was the
kid was in
the
rags in
intent
an
of the
area.
photo?
Was to show that Israel. It was to highlight the terrible danger of landmines to children. But it was Israel as the negative poster child.
It was just a kid next to this sign to show
Sign,
the
but it was. And
juxtaposition.
this is an illustration, and the text showed this is an illustration of the dangers of landmines that are used inappropriately, where there's no consciousness of the regarding the dangers that are posed to these innocent children. There's no context of a conflict. There's no context of this. I assume looked like it was probably posed somewhere in the area of the Golan, maybe in the Galil, but the fact that it was posed, and they put somebody in rags, a small child in rags, as the focus of this, emotional. I went up and I asked the people, and it wasn't just that one yearbook issue. But it was at least 10 different booths where they were handing out material on Israeli war crimes. This was in 2000. War crimes and Israeli violations of international law, all sorts of other themes. Now, this was during the very beginning, sometime at the end of 2000. So we had already had the events of October, end of September, early October, events of Rosh Hashanah, where there was very real fear that there would be a major conflict. There was a lot of bloodshed. On the Palestinian side, it was before the Dolphinarium, but it was as the buildup was growing of a very intense conflict. And this just struck me as a very strange element of international politics, that these themes were dominating what was supposed to be an expert conference on how to deal with the landmine issue, particularly in areas where it was not a simple process. And I wanted to know, who are these organizations? What were they doing? How did they get access to the UN facilities? All sorts of questions. And of course, why was nobody questioning whether this was an appropriate use of funds and focus? And it was all written up in newspapers, and we had newspapers in those days. And journalists were out there covering this, and it was all very much pumped. And I came back, and I was disturbed by this, and I wrote to the people I spoke to them. I wrote to them. It was Human Rights Watch in particular, and I got no serious answers. I particularly asked about the picture, what the source of it was, where it was taken, because I can't, if you say, I'm sure it was posed, you got to have some evidence. So I put it the other way around. What is the basis for this? And they refused. They just stonewalled. And then there were a series of other things that happened very close to that. The next big event was, I was in Canada not too long afterwards.
Quick question though about that. Does Israel plant landmines? Did it plant landmines?
Israel has used various kinds of, I've forgotten what they're called. There's a category of weapons that are used to prevent access of tanks. And
I was always under the impression that most of the landmines in the Golan were planted by the Syrians. Is that not true?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't have an exact answer for that. It was about also demining. But no, Israel does use, or had used at the time, landmines. For instance, the Golan Heights, I don't get too much to military aspects, but we have those various military bases that are sitting on very close. Remember, we're talking about when Syria was a real country, and they had a serious military, and it was there was always the threat of a major conflict. Mm-hmm. And certainly after 1973 and other times, you had to protect those various hilltops that were listening posts and observation posts, small forces. And there had been attacks. There had been small units, whether they were Syrians or Palestinians, that had done some serious damage. There was also, I won't go into the whole other aspects of the Lebanese border and kidnapping of soldiers and bodies, but landmines are a form of protection, which is why of forces, which is why the United States, and it's not just landmines in a simple sense, some of them are more sophisticated. Soviet Union, Russia, China, again, the United States, major powers that were involved in conflict saw that they this is just one example, but I want to bring it home. that saw this as a necessary part of warfare, of self-defense, all over NATO and other areas. The Palestinian organizations were handing out this material, groups like Al-Haq, which is the first Palestinian human rights NGO, entirely funded by Europe. That was one of the first things I found, that Human Rights Watch is an American-based organization, funded primarily by individual donors, but the 10 or so groups that were handing out these flyers with it wasn't just about landmines, then it became Israel as the major source of human rights violations, the suffering of the Palestinians. That was the major theme around that area of the UN where this issue was being discussed. And then I realized that these same groups hand out the same material every time. In those days it was the Human Rights Commission, now it's the Human Rights Council has a meeting, all sorts of other opportunities to promote this image of Israel as Israelis are evil. They kill Palestinians for no reason whatsoever. There's no mention of terrorism, no mention of threats, no mention of history. And that's, I don't say that
flag.
It
raised the red flag.
It bothered me.
Mm-hmm.
It bothered me enough to start a correspondence and to begin to look at this. And so that was, and I realized that there was no academic research. And nobody was writing papers doing research about what is the political role of what are supposed to be non-governmental organizations. And I had no idea that I would be doing this 20 years later at all. I didn't have any idea that we talked just now about $250 million or some other currency per year, just focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But there are other areas, much less so, but again, it's a huge industry. I had no idea how, it's like an archaeological dig. You have one layer, and then you do it, and you see, there's another layer, and that's what's happened to me in the last 20 years. So I could give you more stories where this was brought home, but that was one of the more focused ones. Certainly. It took another year. The Eureka moment was the Durban conference, the UN Durban conference on the World Conference on the Elimination of Racism, Discrimination, and Other Forms of Xenophobia. That's a UN mega thing.
And of course, it talked about all places all around the world suffering from those things.
Of course. It was, in fact, it was advertised as it was going to be the Durban, South Africa, the celebration of the release of, not just the release of Nelson Mandela, but the transition, the end of apartheid, the defeat of apartheid. And that took place at the end of August 2001. But because I had this little itch or red flag of somewhere in between, I began to track what was going on and how this was the kidnapping process, the hijacking, sorry, I think that's a better term, how the NGOs were preparing to hijack that conference, which had it was like a three-ring circus, 3 separate fora. One was diplomats, one was simultaneously, one was NGOs, and the other one was students. But I saw that the NGOs were getting ready to primarily focus on Israel. And I came back from I was in Canada at the time. This was, again, mid 2001. It probably was after the first mega terror attacks. The Dolphinarium, I don't remember what month that was, but there were a series of major terror attacks that started to take place. Bus bombings, other examples. Nobody was discussing that in the human rights framework. They were discussing how terrible Israel was, and this was the theme. And there were more and more of these same NGOs that I saw in Geneva were doing this over and over and over again and preparing for this Durban conference. They brought 5,000 delegates to a stadium in Durban, South Africa, for this NGO forum to approve by voice vote a final declaration that was almost entirely about Israel. There was no other country mentioned.
Mm-hmm. It's called the Durban Declaration or something.
Yeah, the final declaration of the Durban Conference. They were handing out their protocols, the Elders of Zion, marching on T-shirts.
The final declaration.
Except that there were 3 other Durban conferences afterwards that sort of tried to reinforce this.
Okay, but trying to fast forward to this day and age, or this era. because, okay, so NGOs spreading lies, it's very bad, like spreading fake news and fake propaganda against Israel. We don't like them. That's horrendous. But maybe we could live with that. But we're talking about NGOs that actually do many worse things than that, right?
We're talking about NGOs that have an enormous amount of power to set agendas. It's not just, okay, we don't like Israel. In fact, the first response I get from Israeli Foreign Ministry back in those days was shmum. Not important. It's just the United Nations, more declarations. NGOs aren't important. Forget it. They didn't track it at all. Mm-hmm. There was nobody whose job was to track the implications of NGO campaigns. Fast forward to any year you want, 2020, 21, 22, 23. UN Human Rights Council meets 4 times a year plus emergency sessions. At every meeting, every one of those 4 standard meetings, there is one dedicated agenda item to the terrible things that Israel is doing to the Palestinians. At those meetings, they vote on resolutions. The resolutions, one of the resolutions that was adopted led to a boycott list, a BDS list. One of the NGOs at Durban adopted what they used against South Africa, boycotts, divestment, sanction campaign. Part of that goes to businesses that are working in Israel, banks. If you boycott the banks, like the Norwegian Pension Fund wants to do, or you boycott Ben & Jerry's if you want to go to the other end of the spectrum, or all sorts of other business enterprises, you single out Israel. Not any other area that's involved in a conflict, not any other, not all the other examples, only Israel. And that affects all of us.
How so?
If you've served in the Israeli military, if an NGO now writes a report about you, as they're trying to do, and they are doing, that claims that you are responsible for whatever service you're in. You could be in the infantry, you could be in tanks, you could be in the Air Force, you could be running drones, whatever. That you are responsible for the death of an innocent Palestinian. It is very possible. Now, this is an NGO writing this report because they're the ones who have all of the power. They don't have. They made their own mandate up, but the United Nations doesn't have that capability. The International Criminal Court doesn't really have an independent capability. Mm-hmm. I'll give you the example of the Goldstone report in a minute. But they could put together a report about you that could lead to an arrest warrant for any place you go, particularly if it's in Europe. You get off a plane.
But has this happened?
It's happened in a few instances. It hasn't happened at the level of the simple soldier yet. But, for instance, Doron Almog, who was the Southern Command commander of the Southern Section, was told that if he gets off an El Al plane after he left the military, he was going to raise funds for a project that he has of a camp up in the north that is for children with various kinds of it's not Down, something like
special needs.
Special needs. He was going to raise money. He has a son who had that, and he was raising money. And he was told that if he gets off the El Al plane at Heathrow, he's going to be questioned by Scotland Yard. Now, he may not be arrested, but his picture will be taken. It'll be the front pages of all the newspapers in London, and in the UK, and Europe, and probably around the world. Suspected Israeli war criminals questioned by Scotland Yard at Heathrow Airport. He stayed on the plane. He was forewarned and turned around and went back. Tzipi Livni, the minister at the time, she was justice minister. She was also a foreign minister at some point during one of the Gaza conflicts, was also on that list. And I know people at lower levels
and
also.
And Ehud Barak was also mentioned.
Ehud Barak. There is all of the commanders and top politicians were on the list at some point. Bogi Ya'alon, Moshe Dayan, whatever. Ya'alon was on a list. There are others.
But aren't there also NGOs that you monitor that get funded by Europe, by the Germans, who actually, idolize terror or support terrorists, support the families of terrorists?
Directly?
Because we're talking about a big industry, there are the different layers and different kinds. Palestinian NGOs, who established very early close relationship with Europeans. Turns out that's one of the things that when you start to look at this, at the details, we began to see a pattern. What emerged was a group of about 13 and probably more NGOs, non-governmental organizations, funded Palestinian groups, where you have large numbers of officials, not one or two, who are active in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a terrorist organization as listed with all sorts of prohibitions, not only in Israel, but in the United States, in Canada, and the European Union. But they have a NGO network.
Mm-hmm.
So the Europeans say these are two completely unrelated issues. And we don't see any reason not to continue our support. A number of
So that's a funnel for whitewashing money?
Well, what we know about, I'll give you some examples of what we know. And a lot of things we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the examples that we know about is that in August of 2019, a young Israeli, 17-year-old, named Rina Schnerb, with her father and her brother, were in one of the springs not too far from Jerusalem, and a remote bomb was set off. Rina was killed, and her father and brother were injured. A number of Palestinians were arrested. Some have been put on trial. The top people from that cell were officials of a Dutch, largely Dutch, but also EU-funded NGO.
Mm.
And then we see the pattern that there are also other parts of the PFLP network which are around these 13 different NGOs.
So the Palestinians are using the NGOs to set up jobs for their...
Not just jobs, but also cover.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to the Geneva. I'm going to speak in the
course,
United Nations as a human rights activist.
Mm-hmm.
Shawan Jabarin, the head of Al-Haq since around 2000, who I think probably had the idea he didn't have the only idea, but he was the one who really developed it broadly. And so he served time in an Israeli jail as a recruiter, as an activist, as a member of the PFLP. He is the head of the top Palestinian, highly respected, and I put that in quotes, Palestinian NGO named Al-Haq, which gets millions of euros from European governments every year, which goes to the International Criminal Court and the UN Human Rights Council and sits down with the prosecutors and the diplomats of European governments and others and produces the next set of accusations and allegations against Israel. On the one hand, as the Israeli court at some point, the High Court, declared at one point when the Israeli government would not let him travel to accept a human rights award in Europe, the High Court ruled that the evidence shows that he is a human rights activist by day and a terrorist by night.
Like Batman, but in bizarre world.
Yes. You put your head around that.
Yeah.
And it didn't change the European
Policy
relationship with it. I want to add a couple just...
what does that mean by night? What organization
that
he
wears two hats.
No, but I know. But
so one is PFLP,
PFLP, okay.
and the other one is human rights.
But then there's also, because
and there are, as I said, there's
there's
dozens of such
another
people.
leg to this chair, which is the Israeli NGOs. There are Israeli NGOs. The most famous one is the New Israel Fund, but there are others that fund and support culture and also actions that help terrorists, protect terrorists at court, fund theater shows and movies that support terror and strive to eliminate us.
How accurate is that statement?
Sorry?
How accurate is that statement?
It's a little bit too general, too broad.
Okay.
There are organizations, Israeli organizations, there are about 25 of them. They get money every year, all of their money, from either the New Israel Fund, from a combination of the New Israel Fund and European governments. A little bit, I should say, some of them get money also from other sources, but the majority of their money. The New Israel Fund supports dozens or tens of, I think their history, they've supported at least 200 Israeli organizations. And some of them do sheltered for battered women, Ethiopians, all sorts of other social activities. But that core group, Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, Yesh Din, Hamoked, I can name most of them. And in many cases, the head of one becomes the head of the other one. They do play musical chairs. They provide the Israeli end of the evidentiary chain, let's say, the accusations, the allegations, it makes kosher. It's not just Palestinian groups. It's not just Amnesty International with its anti-Semites. It's not just Human Rights Watch with its own obsessive anti-Israel people. But these are Israeli human rights organizations. Mm-hmm. And why would Israelis say things that weren't right? They're incorrect. So that is the part of the New Israel Fund.
And the New Israel Fund itself gets its money from?
Of course, from Europe, also from America.
No, slow down. The New Israel Fund is primarily an American organization. Mm-hmm. It's in some ways it's a government in exile. It was founded after the Likud won the 1977 elections, and Menachem Begin became prime minister. 2 years later, this new Israel. We're going to not the old Israel, but we're going to have a new Israel, a different Israel, a liberal, progressive Israel. Largely based on American money. They have branches fundraising branches in Switzerland, in Germany, in the UK, in Australia, Canada. But it's largely an American organization. American Jews with the old guard of the no longer very attractive to Israeli voters part of the Israeli left. So that's it's Avodah, it's Meretz.
They founded
Soros,
this. Sorry for being.
Soros is also part of this framework.
Elon Musking here, but
no, Soros is part of this. Mm-hmm. But there are also they have events where they'll have a few hundred people come to their I was going to say parties, but they're big dinners, they're gala dinners. It's a social thing. They're based largely on the two coasts, largely in California and in the New York area. And I'll just tell you on the side.
It's a very lucrative business to hate on us.
Well, they say they are sort of saving Israel from itself. Uh-huh. And since the Israeli voters aren't smart enough to do that, then we're going to use these NGOs. So it's a broad range of issues. It's also in issues against Haredim, against other groups within the Israeli society. So they're trying to remake Israel in the American liberal democratic image. That's my summary, along with some of their Israeli allies. So Avram Borg is a major figure in this, among others. And then there are a group of Israelis, but it's American money and directed in combination by these Israelis and Americans.
But it's American citizen money. It's American private money.
It's American private money. They have gotten some grants from the European Union, which at first they denied, and that was part of our research. Nobody had researched this till we started to dig into it. They do file, every year they have to file as an American organization, they have to file with the Internal Revenue Service a very detailed financial report. What's interesting, another interesting part about the NIF, is that they are not in any way registered in Israel. Here's an organization with an annual budget of over $30 million US. Again, we're talking about big bucks, of which a significant amount goes to these organizations that are out there talking about Jewish supremacy and apartheid and other allegations, war crimes, and making it kosher because they're Jewish and they're Israeli. And so the process by which this allocation takes place is entirely secret. We know they have to file the report, so we know where the money goes, more or less, but the process by which they make these decisions is largely hidden. And then what they've been very clever in doing over the last 20 years is that much more money comes from European governments to these same organizations than comes from the NIF.
Mm-hmm. So it's double funding.
It's more,
double dipping.
But it's sort of double dipping.
A higher proportion comes
but now it's more and more. There's some NIF organizations that get 90 or even 100% of their funding from European governments. I think Human Rights Defenders is one of those organizations.
Now, what would happen, just for a thought experiment, if me and Eitan would open an NGO in Germany that basically says that let's say that it's the Muslims' right to... the Muslim immigrants in Germany have the right to take over Germany. Could I do that?
I don't know the specifics in the case of each country. In other words, legally, what the red lines are. If you tell me that you wanted to found an NGO, you wouldn't do it. But an NGO that was denying that the Holocaust ever took place, under German law, that would be illegal. Mm-hmm. On the other aspects, I don't know what the specific legal aspects are, but it's very easy to create an NGO And it's easy to get money from the government. If you were to say, look, I want to foster dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims and Muslim immigrants from all these countries that Germany recently took in, you could easily get a significant sum of money, and probably nobody was going to question what you do with that money other than to check that you don't put it in your own pocket. That the Germans are good at.
So I want to bring it back home for a second. And I'm wondering, in Israel, what's the problem that there is that an NGO might support an organization that speaks out against Israeli military, that claims that the Israeli military commits war crimes? Like, as long as they're not funding directly terrorism, which you mentioned that there are some questionable NGOs that might, in ways that we don't know yet, be directing money in some indirect or direct way to people who are affiliated with terrorist organizations. I'm saying, as long as they're funding organizations like B'Tselem or Breaking the Silence, what's the problem with an NGO, speaking out against the Israeli military?
I'm going to go just one point about the Palestinian...
Other than the fact that it's not patriotic and whatever, but I'm saying...
On the terrorism issue,
yeah.
When you have 70 or more individuals who are getting their salaries, their benefits, whatever it is paid for, even if you don't trace all of them to terrorist acts, but they are members of a terrorist organization, and as I pointed out, some of them have been traced directly, and there have been a couple of people who signed plea bargains that were arrested for funneling money in one group called the Health Workers, HWC Health Workers Consortium or something like that, where they were committee, and they were arrested, raised money from Spanish government in particular, confessed, got a light sentence, and there was real evidence there that money taken from Spanish government, European governments, was used to finance directly terror organizations. So there are some. It's more than just rumors and
okay. Yeah. No. So
back to the
I think
Israeli
we can all
groups.
agree that those guys and that money goes into a bucket of problematic we need to solve.
Okay. So the Israeli organizations fit in there. There's a I was going to say an echo chamber, but it's more than that, of NGOs that gather, that promote a soft power warfare strategy, which is very 21st century. Human rights, one of the people that I learned a great deal about this from was Professor Irwin Cotler, who was the Attorney General of Canada, was I think he was one of the heads of the Canadian delegation at Durban, and he taught international law and human rights, and he said that human rights is the religion of the 21st century, and religions have priests, high priests, and they have a set of beliefs that you're not allowed to question. You don't need to find evidence if somebody says, one of these priestly organizations says you are committing war crimes, and it has lots of consequences. It's not only that you might find that there's an arrest warrant for you. I know of at least one case, I won't mention his name, but one relatively low-level official who, it wasn't even in a combat unit, who was told that if he goes to one of those countries, he will be arrested, or he was questioned. He was more than that. He was questioned at the airport with his family about this allegation that was submitted by an NGO. This has real life consequences. Israelis are constantly being demonized. Israelis as individuals, as a community, as a country. And if your goal is, if the Palestinian goal, and it's much broader than Palestinians, is to erase Israel from the map, no longer will a country exist that is, in the framework of Zionism, a nation state of the Jewish people. It could be a state for all of its citizens. It could be a majoritarian Palestine, whatever it is. If that is the consequence, one of the major consequences, or Israeli banks not being able to function on the international market, we have other issues in our country that are we're warned may hamper our economic growth, but not allowing Israeli banks access to international frameworks could be very, very damaging to all of us. So that's what we're talking about. Those are the goals of the broad movement.
But I think to answer your question, Eitan, I don't think you should make those NGOs, Israeli NGOs, illegal. But why do we need those NGOs? They enjoy tax reductions, right? So at the very least, why should we give those NGOs tax?
So now we're getting to the headlines, today's stories. This is an issue. How do you deal with the Israeli NGOs, with the European funding, with the Palestinians, and a policy level?
By the way, is UNRWA an NGO considered? No.
UN organizations are not NGOs.
Okay.
NGOs are supposed to be non-governmental organizations, civil society. That's a whole issue, by the way, in and of itself. Mm-hmm. What is the rationale, the legitimacy of European governments picking a group of non-governmental organizations and saying these are now, we're going to give them most of their money? And how does that's part of the problem. It was not, first of all, it was under the radar. Nobody in the Israeli government paid much attention to this until the Goldstone report and then the Navi Marmara affair, 2009, 2010. When Judge Richard Goldstone, who had served on various international tribunals, issued a report under the auspices of the UN Human Rights Council saying Israel had committed war crimes, recommended that unless Israel were to do A, B, and C, that he would recommend that the UN Security Council then go to the International Criminal Court. Israel's not a member of the Criminal Court, but if the Security Council were to recommend opening up of cases, that would open the door. And then Israeli military officials began to pay attention. The Defense Department, the head of the army, I had many conversations back in 2009, 2010, including with Richard Goldstone, who said, turns out I didn't really know the details that's in my report. He didn't write his own report. You realize that the whole thing is I'll use the term carefully, a farce, a facade. And it's very political. It's all political. So what Israeli organizations do is they give it legitimacy. How do you deal with that? My first approach that I think has not yet been done and needs to be done is much more intense engagement, dialogue, all those nice terms, confrontation with the European funders. The New Israel Fund can give money to anybody that they want as long as they don't violate Israeli law. I may not like it. I may think that it's not legitimate. I want their donors to get a better idea and not their PR of what they actually do with the money, because I think a lot of those donors, I've had these conversations, some of the donors have taken it seriously, pulled their money, others not. But it's not illegal. I think they should be forced to register as a structure, the non-profit, non-governmental structure in Israel, and submit their reports to the Israelis, not just to the Americans. That's another aspect. But the European money, which is the big money, which is why this proposed law raised such an outcry. It's not the first time. This is the fourth or fifth time since around 2011 or 12 that various legislative initiatives have been tried. Whether it's to tax them, the previous one was that any European or foreign government-funded NGO that goes to the Knesset, to a committee or to lobby or before court would have to wear a special colored tag. Well, that didn't go over very well at all. They're almost gimmicks to try. Let's take this seriously. Every European government that provides funding, and we're talking about 15 different governments plus the EU, from Finland in the north to Spain and Italy in the south, has an embassy in Israel, has an ambassador. I have had many conversations with them, and occasionally they have come to the Knesset to discuss and defend their government's policies, but there's been no consistency. What I would recommend, if I was asked by a minister or a member of the Knesset, is to hold hearings, to have a committee session, not one, but a series, 15 different sessions with 15 different ambassadors, where the information that's all available on NGO Monitor's website, all from open sources. All you got to do is look. You got to know how to look and where to look. But to go in, here's the German ambassador coming to a meeting of the Knesset, where the 15 million euros that Germany, we know about, gives to Israeli and Palestinian NGOs, including many of the ones we've talked about on both the Palestinian and Israeli side, is asked to explain how his government makes this decision. And he will probably say, he will read some sort of a statement about how this is in the best interest and it's civil society and it's democracy without answering the question, because he doesn't know.
Okay.
So what's the stick?
So what good does that do?
Then what happens is that it gets headlines in the German media. And members of parliament in Germany from a pretty broad section of not, except for the far left. And we've seen this in various countries, a little bit in Germany, but I think it needs to be done a lot more. Germany's different because we're all worried about submarines and all sorts of vetoing resolutions, and Germany is our best friend. But I think this is a bigger problem, but other people think differently, which is their privilege in the foreign ministry. But Norway or Switzerland or Belgium, or Spain, I go through the list, right? We go up and down the map.
But what will happen in there?
Then members of parliament will start to ask questions. Why are we spending our money? And we've seen this. Why is taxpayer money going to these Israeli and Palestinian organizations? And what our people are suffering? We don't have enough money. Sweden just cut its foreign aid budget by a huge amount. Got a different government in.
It'll surface to the news for a day or two, headlines, and then it'll kind of
What if
dissipate.
we wanna do-
Why not? I mean,
I don't
to me
know.
it seems a bit of a stretch. Why not simply go after illegal actions like funding terrorism and funding terrorist organizations?
The Israeli.
And then what's the problem with the rest of the money?
That's the
what I'm trying to
Palestinian money, but that's
understand.
not the Israeli NGOs.
So what we're talking about is European governmental money, basically European taxpayer dollars or taxpayer euros being funneled to Israeli NGOs. And I'm wondering, what I'm asking is, what's the problem?
The problem is that, for example, one of the problems is some of those NGOs have lawyers. And for example, if
All of them have
lawyers, and
a lot of
not
lawyers.
only do they go to the Supreme Court with anything. For example, now
Okay.
it's not illegal, unfortunately. Yeah.
So
It's
I'm
not-
saying, so
yeah.
you're trying to solve the problem
Well, let
by
me give
putting
you-
a Band-Aid on it. But I get there's a problem that NGOs with the questionable agendas can just to go to the Supreme Court and submit
so
but why go after the funding of I'm trying to understand what's the problem that
Okay.
breaking the silence gets $1 million a year to
or
spew
5
lies
million or whatever it is.
to spew lies. To me, it sounds like an attack on free speech. For a second.
The issue of, I think that those are very legitimate concerns, and you have to really think about all of the implications, because if you don't, then it ends up actually making the problem worse, because then you get labeled as
Yeah, exactly.
interfering with free speech and all of that. But if you're a victim of a terror attack, you're a family member, your daughter was killed in a bus bombing at Sparrow Pizza in, was it 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
And the killer is up for being released as part of a prisoner deal. And the NGOs have the money to go and make her case. They have hundreds of lawyers. I can give you thousands of examples. That's their full-time job, funded by primarily European governments.
But what's illegitimate about it is what Eitan asks.
It's an unfair, uneven, unbalanced thing. The family of the terror victims, they don't have access to that kind of funding.
But that's not
They don't
Europe's
access to-
fault. That's not Europe's
Yours
fault.
picked a side.
Yeah.
It is not done. There is nothing like what Europeans came up with this idea, was helped by the Palestinians and the Israelis, that NGOs are a means of ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by weakening Israel and strengthening the Palestinians. How do you do that? One of the ways you do that is all the things we're describing. And they call it through civil society, but it's really political warfare. Now, is that illegal? It's very hard to define, as we've seen, what makes it illegal. Is it unfair? Yes. It's very unfair. And that's what I would emphasize. Now, I agree with you that it is not, there's no guarantee this is going to work. But European fairness is an issue. They claim to be promoting these kinds of moral principles. And if it's extremely imbalanced and you're helping the bad guys and you start to have to make up excuses for why you're doing this and not doing it anywhere else, that becomes more difficult to do.
But you don't have to. You can just cut their tax reduction benefits.
Why? Why are they not
But
allowed to be an NGO like any other NGO?
But you're not hurting free speech by doing it.
No,
You're
but
not,
I don't know. But why are
Because
you
they-
cutting
they-
their tax
because-
benefits and not another NGO's tax
because
benefits?
I don't want to give tax benefits to NGOs that strive
Or
to.
funded by
That strive to eliminate the Jewish state.
No, but I don't understand. You can't just say that. You can't
Why?
just because then you're meddling with free speech.
No,
Yes,
I
you
don't
are.
say
What is
that-
the
no,
definition?
I'm not,
What is
I'm
the
not.
definition of trying
And
to?
who decides?
Yeah, what is the definition of you're meddling with the future of the Jewish state? What is the definition?
Well, if they support organizations that promote terror or that promote Israel
by speech.
By speech.
Okay, so
But
then
I'm not
you're
saying
getting into
no,
speech.
because I'm not saying don't allow them to. I'm only saying, we gotta go.
No, I want to make one jump in quickly.
Yeah.
Because I think you're getting to the essence of the issue and how difficult it is to resolve it.
Yeah.
But the question, one of the issues that came up, and it has to do with the judicial reform, and it's been addressed, is by what right does an NGO able to represent a Palestinian prisoner because he doesn't have a cell phone or whatever it is, whatever the issue is?
Mm-hmm.
What gives standing to a non-governmental organization, and particularly one that's funded by a foreign government? That's a much more narrow focus, but I think in many ways it's more legitimate to look at. Standing, there was no such standing until the late 70s. And then the NGOs rushed in. It was a combination of the broader approach, the legal approach of Aaron Barak, and also at the same time the opening up of standing for NGOs, which took great advantage, and all of that is funded by European governments. Literally, there are hundreds of cases.
All I'm saying is I believe
Final
in
words.
a fair game. So if you don't want to allow foreign governments to fund NGOs, then just say that. You can't have funding by foreign governments.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said that was problematic, right? Because it would impact and tons of NGOs across the board. So it's like either you say that or you say that, and then the standing issue. I agree. We should stop the whole idea of NGOs being able to approach the Supreme Court.
Individuals who have a legitimate grievance go to the
Absolutely.
court, but an NGO representing a whole class of people, that's a whole other.
Yeah, 100%.
NGO Monitor is a website in English. You can go check it out, and Hebrew. Go check it out. Highly recommend it. I used it. You can use it to get amazing information. And Professor, thank you so much for coming. You have to rush to the train.
Thank you so much.
And you
appreciate
accept donations?
We
NGO
do accept.
Monitor?
We are an Israeli amuta.
Not from European governments, though.
No, we are very makpi. What's the English word for that? We're very stringent. Strict.
Yeah.
We do not accept any money from the Israeli government in any forum, or European governments, or any other government.
So guys,
because we want to maintain our independence.
Please
We are
go-
really an NGO.
please go to ngomonitor.com. Is that the website?
.org.
.org.
With a dash between the NGO and the monitor.
Okay.
But you'll
Yeah, it
find
has
And
to be said
donate.
that what you guys are doing is really God's work, because you're providing a lot of information what these NGOs, and
That's the
regardless of
key.
legislation, I think that information and transparency is
Take it out
hugely
from under
important.
the ground and put it up on the table for everybody to see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. See you on the next one.